Have you ever wondered why Japanese fantasy often looks more European than Japanese? Why are there medieval castles, blonde elves, and stone dungeon crawls like something straight out of D&D in anime and JRPGs? Hi everyone, my name is Lee, and welcome back to this weird place where we're learning something new about tabletop role-playing games and their place in pop culture. This is going to be the story of how tabletop role-playing games made its way to Japan and how things like Record of Lodoss War and Sword World RPG helped shape the style of fantasy that we still see in games, TV, and anime today. Let's dive right in and let's see how this happened. So, in the West, fantasy grew out of stories like Lord of the Rings. It was a very Tolkien influence. We had King Arthur legends, things of medieval Europe in general. But Japan didn't quite have the same kind of background when it comes to fantasy as a genre. Lord of the Rings didn't get an official Japanese translation until 1972. And even then, it was pretty dense and really formal, so it didn't quite catch on right away. For example, Middle Earth was translated to Nakatsukuni, which literally means middle country. The whole book is full of translations like that are just very, very formal language. And so when Japanese geek culture really started to grow, it wasn't centered around fantasy, it was all around science fiction. From the post-war era through the early 1980s, sci-fi was at the heart of Japanese culture. First, Godzilla came out in 1954, Astro Boy became the first televised anime in 1963, and university science fiction clubs were really popping off. Fan-made doujinshi, which is self-printed publications, or zines, were popular ways of sharing works with each other, and magazines like Sci-Fi Magazine, SF Magazine, were getting popular and coming out at the time. Japan's first science fiction convention was even held back in 1962. Sci-fi was really the popular girl at the time. In 1983, a translator and sci-fi writer named Hitoshi Yasuda also started writing about tabletop RPGs in hobby and sci-fi magazines. He wrote 2 articles. I believe he published an article in a magazine called Login, and it was kind of one of those things that first introduced what a tabletop RPG was to the general public. Of course, it was about sci-fi RPGs at the time. The first RPG that got a Japanese translation was Traveler, which is a space exploration RPG that happened in 1984. D&D and fantasy did eventually come to Japan, but it had a tough start. So pre-1985, it was only available in English, it was expensive, and it just wasn't the same type of book that Japanese people know and are used to. So most Japanese books come in the bunko size, which is about an A6. It's small, it's paperback, it's usually black and white and doesn't have a lot of illustrations in it. So for example, if we go back to the Lord of the Rings, I think the Fellowship of the Ring in bunko size is actually 3 separate books that has to be split up. And so D&D was only available in its original format. So this big giant hardcover book, and you couldn't go to a regular bookstore to buy it either. You'd had to go to a hobby shop or a toy store. So if you didn't live in one of the big cities in Japan, you probably weren't able to find it anyway. The only people who picked up D&D early on were probably enthusiasts of war games or PC gamers who were already familiar with games like Wizardry or Ultima, which were really popular in Japan. In 1985, D&D finally got a proper Japanese translation, and it was pretty successful. It started to slowly become a little bit more popular. So the first edition that they brought was the red box. It sold about 100,000 copies in its first year. So, it did okay for a little bit. But then in 1991, they tried to transition to advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But due to a limited print run and the expenses in relation to translation and all that, it was a financial disaster. I believe it only sold 10,000 copies or something. It was even more expensive than the previous version was. And then in 1994, MediaWorks acquired the license to D&D from Shinwa, and they started publishing paperback versions. They had brought Group SNE back to D&D with a translation of D&D Rules Cyclopedia, and I think this is the first time that D&D had ever done a full extensive edit on their rulebook. So instead of being a big hardcover book, it was divided into multiple paperbacks of bunko size. The layout was changed, and a lot of the illustrations were actually replaced with manga-like illustrations that were familiar for Japanese people. The translation first published the rules for levels 1 to 9 in 3 different books. So you had the player's book, the Dungeon Master book, and then a Monsters book. They also had a bunch of different mix of media at the time that all kind of advertised what D&D was. D&D had a magazine circulating in Japan, and Capcom even teamed up with them to make an arcade game. In the mid-1980s, a group of friends, including Yasuda Hitoshi, who would later form the company Group SNE, were playing Dungeons and Dragons together. Instead of just taking notes, they fully transcribed their game sessions, including character dialogue, out-of-character conversation, the DM narrating, all of that. And they started publishing these replays in the magazine Comptic under the title Record of Lodoss War, starting in 1986. These became super popular. Readers absolutely loved it. It reached an audience of tens of thousands of people a month. You didn't need to understand how tabletop RPGs work to enjoy it. It read like a regular fantasy novel. It had illustrations, it had dialogue, and it was very easily digestible. A little side note, Comptic is just a regular computer magazine, so it wasn't something that was geared only towards hobbyists or really niche things. It was a very common interest that a lot of people had, so the magazine circulated to a ton of people. For a lot of people in Japan, this was the first time that they had ever seen what a tabletop RPG could look like. Kadokawa had actually planned to publish these Record of Lodoss War replays as a compilation and sell it as a paperback, but TSR, who is the creators of D&D, and Shinwa, who is the licensor of D&D in Japan, had only allowed the publication of these serialized actual play sessions, but they didn't want those sessions to become compiled and sold as a book under the D&D brand. And so there was even an interview with Hitoshi Yasuda, who had said, "We made Record of Lodoss War because we wanted to promote D&D, but TSR didn't allow us to make Record of Lodoss War a part of their D&D promotion." The situation was really complicated because in D&D, the license was also handled by two different companies. The game itself was sold by Shinwa, and peripheral materials such as these replays and novels were handled by Kadokawa, who Group SNE was working with. Kadokawa basically went back to Group SNE and was like, hey, they are not going to allow us to print this novel of Record of Lodoss War with the D&D brand, so let's make your own system, make your own rules, replay the campaign, and we will publish that. And they did, and that was a huge success. Record of Lodoss War was published as a novel based on those original sessions, but they didn't use any of the D&D brand. They had basically come up with their own RPG system, and that's what they used. So this and later sequels went on to become a huge hit, eventually reaching over 10 million copies. And when Group SNE made a sequel to the Record of Lodoss War replay, that's when they switched to using their own original Record of Lodoss War RPG system. And eventually in 1989, they even came out with their own native tabletop role-playing game, Sword World RPG, which is set partially in the Record of Lodoss War area, place, geography. So let's talk a little bit about Sword World. Sword World was designed to fit Japan's gaming culture. It only uses 6-sided dice, which were the easiest type of dice to find at the time in Japan. A unique feature to Sword World is something called fellows. So essentially, you can create an NPC for other people's games. You have a character sheet specifically for fellows, or you can turn one of your existing characters into a fellow, and they have stats, they have a random roll chart for combat actions, and you can even write in little lines of dialogue that they would say during combat, and you can post them online or you can download them. They would stay in the background unless you go into combat, and like they cannot die, they cannot take damage. If they do die, they're said to just mysteriously disappear. After you use a fellow, the book encourages people to contact the fellow's creator and thank them and give them a little recap of the adventure that they went on. I just think it's really cute and reminds me so much of all the Souls games where, you know, people leave messages for you, people like help you out, or you can just summon a friend and help you fight some insane boss, you know, driving you insane because it's been 20 hours and you still can't beat it. I don't know if this is 100% a correlation, but I wonder if something like Sword World had inspired this kind of trope in other Japanese fantasy things that we see today. A lot of other Japanese values that we can see that come into Sword World are things like adventurers don't fight each other. Because adventurers should work together, fighting with other adventurers is considered the greatest taboo. Another one is no two adventurers or adventurer parties can take on the same job. Once taken on, a job can be taken on by another group only if the first one has given up or killed without completing it. which kind of ties us all back to like the adventurer guild trope that you see in a lot of Japanese fantasy and a lot of animes and games and stuff. And then another one that kind of reflects the collective way of thinking that Asian cultures tend to have is adventurers help other adventurers. Adventurers are encouraged to help other adventurers in need as much as possible, and if they come across fallen adventurers, they should do their best to bring their bodies home, which is just really beautiful and really sweet. Rather than copying D&D, Swordwell kind of adapted the RPG experience specifically to a Japanese audience, and it really permeated a lot of these tropes into the things that we consider Japanese fantasy today. So what started as a series of articles in a magazine replay turned into a light novel, and then a manga, and then a 13-episode anime OVA, and Record of Lodoss War is still mega popular to this day. Even in 2017, there was a live-action play adaptation of that campaign. So it became Japan's first big fantasy franchise, and it showed people what fantasy could look like in a Japanese setting from Japanese creators. Even though it looks like Western fantasy on the surface, it comes from Japanese players, gameplay, and it's got Japanese ideals peppered throughout. So after that, or kind of around the same time, fantasy really took off in Japan. JRPG video games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy came out in 1986, 1987 respectively, and they were both heavily influenced by D&D and wizardry. They all came out at around the same time that Lodoss War was first being serialized, and the fantasy genre really only blew up from there. Light novels started using RPG-style systems like classes and skill trees. Anime series began to include things like party-based adventures and dungeon-style storytelling, and there's even this long-lasting legacy of a translation error where kobolds in the advanced D&D version in Japanese were said to have a dog-like snout and mouth, and it was taken by the translator at the time and mistranslated to "they are dog persons," which in turn created this dog person kobold design. And something similar happened with orcs, because orcs are largely depicted to be very pig-like in appearance in Japanese media. It's really interesting to me that Japanese fantasy started out based on Western fantasy, but it really became its own thing. It became rooted in Japanese gameplay and imagination, and even though a lot of things did originally come from D&D, everything kind of spun around and it took its own life and it just became its own thing in Japan. I love how the creativity of a group of people sitting around a table rolling dice has influenced a whole genre of pop culture. It's really fascinating to see how we all interpret the same set of instructions differently based on the cultures and your geography. I just think it's really fun and inspiring, and I hope that you're inspired to sit down, play a game with your friends, and who knows, maybe you guys will be the next ones to make the next big grimdark hit or be the next Critical Role or something. You never know, right? Thank you for watching. A huge thank you to our Patreon subscribers, and let me know in the comments, what is your favorite fantasy trope? Is it that you're hired to escort a caravan, but then you get ambushed by a group of goblins? Is it something as simple as dragons? If you like this video, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe for more things about pop culture, tabletop role-playing games, and I promise I will talk about something other than Japan next time. I really love Japan. It's a place that I grew up in, but I am not Japanese and I am not fluent, so I'm so sorry if anything was wrong. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next one.